For decades, tariffs have been a fiercely debated policy, and with Trump back in the spotlight, the debate has reignited. Once again, they're being touted as the key to revitalizing American industry, protecting jobs, and rebalancing trade. But will they work, or lead to another costly miscalculation? Tariffs carry a nostalgic appeal, symbolizing a golden age when the U.S. protected its industries and built its manufacturing dominance. Politicians frame them as a solution to outsourcing and unfair competition. But history tells a more complicated story. The global economy has evolved, with complex supply chains, deep trade ties, and risks of retaliation. The real question is, can tariffs still work today? And if large-scale tariffs return, will they restore U.S. economic strength or trigger inflation and trade wars? Let's dive deep into the truth about tariffs, how they work, what history teaches us, and whether they are an economic lifeline or a costly mistake. Let's begin. To understand whether tariffs can truly revive the U.S. economy, we first need to break down what they are and how they function. At their core, tariffs are taxes imposed on imported goods. When a government places a tariff on a foreign product, it effectively raises the cost of that product for domestic consumers. The intended effect? To make imported goods less attractive and encourage people to buy locally produced alternatives. In theory, this protects domestic industries, keeps jobs within the country, and reduces reliance on foreign manufacturing. But tariffs don't exist in isolation. They are a key instrument of protectionism, an economic philosophy that prioritizes shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. Protectionism stands in direct contrast to free trade, which promotes the unrestricted flow of goods and services between countries. Tariffs are one of the oldest tools of protectionism, often used alongside quotas, subsidies, and trade restrictions to influence economic outcomes. One of the most ambitious protectionist strategies is import substitution industrialization. The idea behind this is simple. Instead of relying on foreign-made products, a country uses tariffs to make imports expensive and encourages local industries to develop their own alternatives. By protecting young industries from foreign competition, governments hope to stimulate domestic production, create jobs, and achieve economic self-sufficiency. In theory, this approach can work. Many countries, including the US, have historically used tariffs to jumpstart their industrial sectors. But ISI also comes with significant risks. If tariffs remain too high for too long, domestic industries can become inefficient, consumers may face higher prices, and international trade tensions can escalate. So, do tariffs still serve a purpose in today's highly globalized economy? That's where things get complicated. While some argue that tariffs are necessary to counter unfair trade practices and protect national security, others warn that they distort markets, disrupt supply chains, and provoke retaliatory measures from other nations. To fully understand their impact, we need to look at history, starting with how tariffs helped shape the U.S. economy in the past. Tariffs have played a defining role in shaping the U.S. economy, dating all the way back to the country's founding. In fact, for much of the 19th century, tariffs were the largest single source of federal revenue, funding the government before income taxes were introduced in 1913. But beyond revenue, tariffs were a core strategy used to industrialize America and protect domestic industries from foreign competition from established European manufacturers. One of the most famous tariff laws was the Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations, which imposed heavy duties on imported goods, some as high as 62%. Then comes the Morrill Tariff of 1861, passed just before the Civil War, raised rates even further. By the late 19th century, U.S. tariffs averaged 30–50% on imports. This strategy largely worked. Between 1820 and 1900, the U.S. economy grew rapidly, with GDP per capita increasing by nearly 400%. Tariffs helped fuel this expansion by protecting local industries, giving them the time and space to develop without being undercut by cheaper foreign imports. Companies like Carnegie Steel and Standard Oil thrived under these conditions, and by the early 20th century, the U.S. had become the world's largest economy. But tariffs weren't a perfect solution. While they benefited industrial regions in the North, they severely hurt the agrarian South, which relied on selling cotton and other goods to Europe. Higher tariffs meant that foreign nations retaliated by placing their own tariffs on American agricultural products, reducing demand for U.S. exports. One of the worst tariff-induced crises in U.S. history was the Nullification Crisis of 1832, when South Carolina, outraged by high tariffs, threatened secession, bringing the nation to the brink of conflict. By the early 20th century, the U.S. began questioning its reliance on tariffs. The economy had grown large and competitive enough to engage in global trade, and businesses started pushing for lower tariffs to access foreign markets. However, in 1930s, the tariff debate reignited. During the Great Depression, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised duties on over 20,000 imported goods. The idea was to protect American industries and workers from foreign competition during a time of economic hardship. But instead of saving the economy, it made things worse. Over 30 countries retaliated with their own tariffs, leading to a collapse in global trade. U.S. exports dropped by 61% between 1929 and 1933, worsening the economic downturn. By the time World War II ended, the U.S. was producing over 50% of global industrial output and had learned an important lesson. While tariffs had once helped industrialize the country, excessive protectionism could also backfire, causing trade wars and economic stagnation. This realization led to a major shift in U.S. trade policy, moving from protectionism toward free trade. To facilitate this, the U.S. took the lead in creating a new global trade order. In 1947, it helped establish the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, an international framework aimed at reducing tariffs and trade barriers. Over time, GATT evolved into the World Trade Organization in 1995, setting the stage for a massive expansion of global trade. Between 1945 and 1973, world trade expanded at an average annual rate of 8%, compared to just 3% in the pre-war era. The U.S. benefited immensely from this boom, exporting goods across the world while keeping domestic prices low through cheaper imports. One of the key reasons behind the shift to free trade was the theory of comparative advantage, developed by economist David Ricardo in the 19th century. The idea is simple. Countries should specialize in producing goods where they have an advantage and trade for everything else. This, in theory, leads to greater efficiency, lower costs, and higher economic growth. For example, the U.S. focused on high-tech industries, finance, and services, while countries like Japan and Germany became manufacturing powerhouses. This interdependence accelerated globalization, leading to the rise of multinational corporations, just-in-time supply chains, and economic interconnectivity. By 1980, over 80% of U.S. tariffs had been reduced, and America entered into multiple free trade agreements, including over 20 countries. Free trade wasn't just about economics, it was also a geopolitical strategy. The Cold War played a crucial role in pushing the U.S. towards free trade policies, as American leaders believed that integrating countries into the global economy would prevent the spread of communism. By encouraging trade and economic cooperation, the U.S. hoped to create a world order centered around Western capitalism. Between 1950 and 2000, U.S. GDP grew from $300 billion to over $10 trillion, and millions of Americans enjoyed rising wages and a booming middle class. But free trade also had downsides, including the loss of manufacturing jobs due to outsourcing. By the 2010s, frustration over globalization had reached a boiling point in the United States. Decades of free trade had lowered consumer prices and boosted corporate profits, but it had also led to factory closures, job losses, and trade imbalances, particularly with China. This set the stage for a major policy reversal, the return of tariffs under Donald Trump, something we saw in 2018. The Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on imported goods, particularly from China. These tariffs were justified on two main grounds: protecting American jobs and correcting the trade deficit that had reached $375 billion with China in 2017. The tariffs were rolled out in phases from March 2018. Initially, a 25% tariff was imposed on imported steel and 10% on aluminum, targeting global suppliers. By 2019, tariffs covered over $360 billion worth of Chinese imports, making it one of the largest trade wars in history. One of the first major effects of the tariffs was a rise in consumer prices. Since many foreign products were now more expensive due to tariffs, businesses passed these costs on to consumers. For example, the price of washing machines surged by 12% after Trump imposed a 50% tariff on imported models. A study by the Federal Reserve found that the tariffs cost the average American household $1,277 per year due to higher prices and reduced purchasing power. This contradicts the common assumption that tariffs only hurt foreign producers. In reality, the costs are often paid by domestic consumers. The 2018 tariffs provided a clear view of both the winners and losers, highlighting the complexities of trade policy in a modern, globalized economy. After imposition of 25% on imported steel, the U.S. steel industry became a key winner of the 2018 tariff war. By 2019, U.S. steel production rose by 6% from the previous year, while imports of steel into the U.S. fell by 28%. However, an unintended consequence of these tariffs was rising costs for American manufacturers, especially those that relied on imported raw materials like steel and aluminum. U.S. automakers, including Ford and GM, reported that Trump's steel tariffs increased their production costs by over $1 billion. GM CEO Mary Barra stated that the steel tariffs raised the price of making a car by about $200. A 2019 analysis by Moody's estimated that U.S. businesses paid $32 billion in additional tariffs, increasing financial strain on companies. Ironically, while the tariffs were meant to protect American manufacturers, they ended up hurting many industries that depended on global supply chains. One of the biggest lessons from the 2018 tariff experiment was that blanket tariffs don't always work as intended. While they protected some industries, they created inefficiencies elsewhere. For instance, Canada imposed tariffs on U.S. whiskey, blue jeans, and motorcycles, while European Union tariffs hit U.S. goods like Harley-Davidson motorcycles and bourbon whiskey. Retaliatory tariffs from China hit U.S. farmers particularly hard, as China slashed agricultural imports from America. Soybean exports, for example, fell by 71% in 2018, forcing the U.S. government to provide $28 billion in bailout payments to farmers. Furthermore, the tariffs failed to eliminate the trade deficit. By 2019, the U.S. trade deficit with China was still over $345 billion, with little improvement. By 2020, the trade war had led to slower GDP growth, market uncertainty, and a struggling manufacturing sector. While tariffs are designed to protect domestic industries, businesses don't simply absorb the extra costs. They find ways to work around them. Whether through legal loopholes, shifting supply chains, or outright reclassifying goods, companies have long mastered the art of avoiding tariffs. One of the most common methods for avoiding tariffs is transshipment, where goods are routed through a third country before being imported into the U.S. For example, many Chinese companies rerouted exports through Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan before sending them to the U.S. In 2019, a report from U.S. Customs and Border Protection found that some Chinese steel was being shipped to South Korea and Vietnam, where it was relabeled as locally produced before entering the U.S. to dodge tariffs. This tactic is difficult to police because it requires extensive supply chain tracking and enforcement, something many government agencies lack the resources for. Secondly, rather than pay tariffs, many multinational corporations simply move production to tariff-free countries. Apple, for example, responded to the US-China trade war by shifting some iPhone assembly from China to India and Vietnam to reduce its reliance on Chinese manufacturing. Nike and Adidas reduced manufacturing in China and relocated factories to Indonesia and Vietnam to avoid penalties on Chinese-made goods. This relocation weakens the impact of tariffs because jobs don't necessarily return to the US. They just shift to other low-cost nations. Thirdly, some businesses exploit technical loopholes in product classification to sidestep tariffs. In 2018, Mercedes-Benz avoided 25% US tariffs on vans by shipping vehicle parts to South Carolina and assembling them in the US, exploiting a lower tariff rate on parts rather than finished vehicles. Government agencies often struggle to keep up with these evasions because customs enforcement is slow, and trade laws contain numerous gray areas that companies can legally exploit. Although Customs and Border Protection increased its inspections, but with $4 trillion in annual U.S. imports, policing every shipment is virtually impossible. And in the end, tariffs often create more bureaucracy without necessarily achieving their intended economic impact. The key takeaway is that tariffs are not an ironclad strategy for reshoring jobs or rebuilding industries. As long as businesses have access to global supply chains, they will find ways to work around tariffs, whether through transshipment, relocation, or legal loopholes. Today, more than 70% of global trade involves intermediate goods, parts and components that cross multiple borders before becoming a final product. This means that tariffs don't just hit foreign manufacturers. They also disrupt American businesses that rely on imported parts. A single product might be assembled in one country, with parts sourced from 5 others. For example, Boeing 787 Dreamliner contains over 2.3 million parts from suppliers in Japan, Germany, Italy, and South Korea. Tariffs on any of these countries increase Boeing's costs. Secondly, for the US, there is a great shift from manufacturing to services. In 1950, manufacturing accounted for 30% of US GDP. Today, it's just 11%, while services account for nearly 80%. The US economy is now dominated by sectors like finance, technology, healthcare, and entertainment, which don't benefit from tariffs the same way traditional industries did. This raises a critical issue. If the US economy is service-driven, can tariffs still be a relevant tool for growth? Furthermore, while tariffs are often framed as a way to revive American manufacturing, they don't address the core reasons why jobs moved overseas in the first place. Firstly, automation replaced more jobs than outsourcing. According to a 2017 study by the Ball State Center for Business and Economic Research, automation accounted for 88% of U.S. manufacturing job losses from 2000 to 2010, far more than offshoring. Companies didn't just leave for cheap labor. They also replaced workers with robots and AI-driven production lines. Even if tariffs bring some factories back, many of the jobs won't return because modern manufacturing is far more automated than before. Secondly, production costs in the US are way higher than they are in China and Mexico. Like wages in China are still less than 1/3 of US wages for manufacturing workers. Electricity costs in the US are higher than in China and Mexico, making it expensive to run factories. And regulatory and environmental compliance add further costs that many companies avoid by manufacturing overseas. This means that even if tariffs force companies to rethink their sourcing, they may relocate to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, or India instead of returning to the US. The world of trade has changed dramatically since the 20th century, and tariffs alone can't rebuild the American economy. While they can be useful in protecting strategic industries, broad tariffs often raise prices, disrupt supply chains, and provoke retaliation. While the economic effects of tariffs are widely debated, there is one argument that cannot be ignored: national security. In an increasingly uncertain world, where supply chains are vulnerable to geopolitical tensions, tariffs are sometimes seen as a necessary tool to safeguard critical industries. From semiconductors to energy production, the US is realizing that outsourcing too much manufacturing has left it exposed to economic coercion by rival nations. Today, 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made by Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. If China were to invade Taiwan or block exports, the US would face an unprecedented technology crisis, affecting everything from smartphones to fighter jets. To reduce dependence, the US passed the CHIPS and Science Act, 2022, allocating $52 billion to boost domestic semiconductor production. But this will take years to scale up. Not only this, but China controls over 60% of the world's rare earth minerals, which are essential for military technology, electric vehicles, and renewable energy. In 2010, China cut rare earth exports to Japan over a territorial dispute, showing that it can weaponize supply chains. In 2023, China restricted exports of gallium and germanium, two critical metals for semiconductors, in response to US sanctions. These examples highlight why depending on adversarial nations for essential materials is a serious national security risk. To reduce dependence on foreign rivals, some tariffs can be justified to rebuild domestic industries critical to national security. For example, the US military relies on Chinese-made microelectronics, a huge vulnerability if tensions escalate. Tariffs and government incentives can force companies to develop secure supply chains for military-grade technology. Strategic tariffs can protect industries that are too important to leave vulnerable to foreign supply chain disruptions. Tariffs can play a critical role in protecting national security, but they must be used strategically. Over-reliance on foreign nations for semiconductors, rare earths, and energy has put the US in a vulnerable position, and tariffs can help rebuild these industries. After examining the economic, historical, and geopolitical aspects of tariffs, one thing becomes clear. Tariffs are neither a magic bullet for economic revival nor an outdated relic of the past. Instead, they are a tool, one that must be used carefully, strategically, and in combination with other policies. So are tariffs an economic lifeline or a costly mistake? The answer isn't black and white. It depends on how, when, and where they are applied. Our discussion so far makes it clear that tariffs are a double-edged sword. If tariffs are used recklessly, they can spark inflation, hurt US businesses, and provoke trade wars, ultimately damaging the economy. And if they are used strategically, they can protect key industries, safeguard national security, and level the playing field against unfair trade practices. So, instead of broad, indiscriminate tariffs, the US should focus on targeted, strategic tariff policies that strengthen its economy without unnecessary economic fallout. What do you think? Are tariffs necessary to rebuild American industry, or do they cause more harm than good? Let us know in the comments! And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more insightful breakdowns on global economics and trade.